Ngalakin Khadijan Nyunga Boja.
Welcome back. So, I'm now going to explain the difference between behavioral finance and classical finance. Now, essentially, classical finance can be summarized quite simply. It assumes that investors exhibit consistent preferences and they evaluate information without bias. That is, they're rational. They have a specific goal, which is to maximize wealth and to reduce their risk. And whenever information comes to them, they evaluate it, they assess it correctly, they weight it correctly, that they're not biased in their evaluations. And given that the information they have, they come to the optimal decision that results in them maximizing their profits whilst reducing their risk. Behavioral finance has a different view on of people. What behavioral finance assumes that people aren't necessarily consistent in their behavior, but that the brain uses heuristics, which is rules of thumbs, mental shortcuts, to cope with limited capacity and information. One way to think about this is to assume that behavioral finance considers the brain like a computer with limited capacity, limited memory, and then asks itself, how would it operate in this environment if you had limited capacity and information? What kind of mental shortcuts would it take to be able to navigate the world effectively? So the context is like, it takes an evolutionary perspective. It says we evolved in a very different environment, and whilst we're evolving in that environment, we developed, we saw, or our ancestors saw, particular relationships, and they made us connections, and eventually those connections became hardwired in their brain, and we learned to rely on those relationships automatically, without thinking, as it were. So in those kind of settings in which we evolved, the rules of thumb, what we call heuristics, work effectively. And so we are successful because, by and large, our heuristics, our mental shortcuts, were very good. The ones that weren't effective, well, they resulted in mistakes being made, mistakes that often would have been fatal, so that people died. So us, the survivors, have ended up with a highly developed and adaptive set of mechanisms to manage our environment. The problem is these heuristics, mental shortcuts, work in a particular setting. In an unusual context, those mental shortcuts or heuristics can mislead. And financial markets aren't like the savannah, aren't like the forest. So they're one setting for which our brains haven't been adapted, and so there's a large potential for mistakes. What we reflexively rely on might result in outcomes that aren't in our best interest. To give an example of what I mean by heuristics, let's have a look at this. We rely on heuristics, and if you see this, a set of 3 lines over here, and I'll ask you which one is longer. Now, because you're smart third-year students at the University of Western Australia, you'll know that all of the lines are equal in length. But you know as well that the one in the middle appears to be a bit longer. The others seem a bit shorter. So it's just where there's a visual illusion over here going on that makes us think that the one in the middle is longer. Perhaps a starker one. If I'll ask you, which square is darker, A or B? Now you'll tell me A, of course. And I'd agree with you. From this particular angle, the way we're looking at it, from this particular context, A seems darker than B. But actually, this is really an illusion. The two of them, A and B, have been painted the same shade. They're the same. A is as dark or as light as B. They're equally. It's simply because of the shadow that's been cast in this particular way that makes B seem lighter than A. If you don't believe me, look it up. Look it up on Google and check out the checker shadow illusion. This is an important thing. It tells you something about the way our brain is constructed. In some ways, and I say this with not much exaggeration at all, this could be one of the most important slides you ever see at uni. Because this tells you something important about the way the brain, it illustrates something important about the way the brain works. We operate by comparisons. Everything we do, everything we assess around the world is relative. And that relative, the fact that everything is relative, makes a huge difference, affects just about every single decision that we make. So how you compare, so bear this in mind, if you're feeling down, so one very practical way of doing this is if you think of other people less fortunate than yourselves, it's one way of lifting yourself up. I mean, that's one example. But really there are a whole lot of other instances where what you benchmark on makes a difference to how you feel, to your assessment of a particular situation. Then we'll come back to more examples. But in a similar context, framing, how you see things, how you perceive them relative to other things, make a big difference to how we're influenced. So we're influenced by context, the way information is presented. Here's a contemporary example, or one that fits our current times, regrettably. But let's say Australia is preparing for a rare disease expected to kill 600 people. Just at the moment, we have, just put these numbers, we have 28 people have died so far from the coronavirus in Australia. So we expect to kill 600 people. 2 medical programs are proposed. Which program would you favour, given these estimates of the consequences of the programs? So, if program A is adopted, 400 people will die. If program B is adopted, there's a 1/3 probability that no persons will die, and a 2/3 probability that 600 people will die. So pick. Now, there's no right or wrong, as I said. You could prefer the destruction of the whole world to your scratching of your finger, but this is one of those similar situations, ask your value. But mostly, people tend to prefer program B. Now, let me put a different frame, a different choice. If program C is adopted, 200 people will be saved. If program D is adopted, there is a 1/3 chance that 600 people will be saved and a 2/3 probability that no persons will be saved. So, again, which one would you prefer? There's no right or wrong answer. It turns out that it makes a difference. These two frames are actually identical. If take for example the frame 1 and frame 2. If program A is adopted, 400 people will die. Frame 2 says if program C is adopted, 200 people will be saved. But if 200 people are saved, that means 400 people are dead. So they're identical, but just phrased differently. The framing is different. It turns out how you frame it makes a big difference to the choices people make. So it's in the frame 1, frame A is chosen only by 22% of participants, where 400 people will die. Frame B, where there's a 1/3 probability that no persons will die, is chosen by 78% of participants in a survey. On the other hand, when only frame C and D is provided, the same choices but worded differently, program C is chosen by 72% of participants and program D by 28% of participants. Framing makes a difference. So that's an example of the heuristics at work. We're led by our biases, unconscious or otherwise, to make decisions that we that mightn't necessarily align with what we really want, or mightn't be in our best interests. There. The thing is, if the heuristics are hardwired in our brain, mere awareness may be insufficient to counteract the effects. Because these are biases that have been inbuilt in us, that we've evolved that have evolved over millions of years. So we may have to manipulate the context to ensure we're not misled. So the question then becomes, if we do this, how do we know the likely sources of the biases? And this is what David Hirschleifer, psychologist and also a finance academic, has pointed out. He says that we can usefully classify people's behavior into three forms of evolutionary adaptation mechanisms. And for the idea behind this, read The Design of a Fungus Eater. And I'll come to this shortly. But what he says is that there are three mechanisms that the brain uses in adapting to the world, in this complex world that in order to make sense of it and to allow us to make the right kind of decisions. So one is this heuristic simplification. Heuristic simplification is the use of shortcuts in using information. So, for example, fuzzy edges means generally that the object is further away. So you can see this when you go to the Cottesloe Beach and you're looking at a rock nest. Sometimes rock nest appears so clear, and because it appears so clear, it appears closer. On the other hand, there are times when there's a mist or a haze that covers rock nest and it appears further away. That's our brain using this heuristic. If something is clearer, if it has fewer fuzzy edges, then if it's got sharp edges, the object must be closer. The other form is self-deceptions. Again, this might seem an odd thing, but sometimes our brain acts in a way to fool ourselves. We may have inaccurate perceptions to increase the odds of survival. How might this work? Well, let me give you an example. Let's say this is a silly example, but it's a contrived example to make it just to make the point in a way clear. Let's say you're a tribe living in a village, and in a small village, and you're barricaded, and suddenly there's a ferocious roar, and so there's a big beast outside, which looks like it's strong enough to trample the walls, the flimsy walls surrounding the village, and it's going to destroy everyone within the village if it gets in. So clearly something must be done to kill this beast before the beast destroys the whole village. So the villagers have to go and fight it. The question then becomes, who is going to do this? You want to send the best placed, the strongest, most fittest people in the village to fight, because if the beast isn't killed, everyone will be destroyed. So you want to give it the best shot that you have. So of course, the best shot of this would be the strongest, fittest, fastest people in the group would be the young men. So maybe men in the age of 18 to 24. They would be the strongest, fastest, fittest. They have to go out. Now, if they're scared, if they have they might know that by going out, they're more likely to die, because there's a high chance that they'll die. And so they'd prefer to send someone else. They might have a different plan. Let's say, let's send out the old man, because his life isn't worth that much, or is coming to the end of his life. So let's send out the old guys rather than us, because we're young. But if really we need them to go out, so nature would do this, would give these men a sense of confidence, would endow them with overconfidence. And so because they're overconfident, they're willing to take more risk. They don't see the risks, they underplay the risks because of their overconfidence. So the young men go out, a few of them get mauled, and a few of them die, but then the beast is killed and the village is saved to live another day. But in this case, the self-deception, this illusion of control, gave the men the confidence to take a risky action that saved the village there. Similarly, we have, again, so this is why young men perhaps are overconfident and take more risks, because in the long run, that risk while it might be detrimental to individuals in the short term, in the long run it helps everyone else survive. Similarly, the other one is emotional commitment. Sometimes you need to commit to something regardless of the expected consequences. You can't go in half-heartedly. If you go in half-heartedly, you won't commit all the resources required to succeed. And so, in this case, you decide to go berserk because you're overriding the reason, you're behaving unreasonably to stick to a path. That way, you're sending a credible signal to other people that, yes, you have committed here, and by sending that credible commitment, you're more likely to win this. This whole concept behind this, and you don't have to read this, but I'll just alert you to one of the most influential articles in artificial intelligence, which is by this Masano Toda, a Japanese academic, who said, the design of a fungus eater, a model of human behavior in an unsophisticated environment. He brought up this whole idea, he brought up this notion that maybe we could understand the brain, how the brain evolves, by thinking, if we were to put a robot in an unsophisticated environment, what kind of rules of behavior would we encode in that robot to make that robot be able to survive in that environment? This is where, and then all the environment has is a fungus eater. So, and he described this, and it's been a source of great inspiration for people to think about how the brain works. So it's an easy article to read, which I've included in the recommended readings there. But now let's go on to look at the examples of heuristic simplifications to show you this point, and then we can then see how this affects us in an investing context. So here is this limited attention, limited memory, and limited processing capacity mean that the brain needs to focus on a subset information and needs to take shortcuts in drawing inferences about how the world is. So some examples are the representative heuristic, the preference for familiarity, anchoring adjustment, etc. And I'll go through each of these in turn. So the representative heuristic. So Mary is quiet, studious, and concerned with social issues. While an undergraduate at UWA, she majored in English literature and environmental studies. Given this information, indicate which of the following cases is most probable. Mary is a librarian. Mary is a librarian and a member of the Greens Party. Mary works in the banking industry. So if you look at this, you kind of think, she majored in English literature, environmental studies, so she might like books, she likes the environment. Probably B is the one, because B fits the kind of image, it's representative of the kind of person with those characteristics, it's most representative. But actually, if you think about it, it couldn't be B, because with B, you have to satisfy, we asked you which of the following cases is the most probable. If you look at B, for B to be true, there have to be two conditions. You've got to be that Mary is a librarian and a member of the Green Party. So it's actually more likely, the answer is more likely to be A rather than B. Because while there are many librarians, not all of them are members of the Green Party. So it's more likely that Mary is a librarian. But then, whilst Mary, perhaps being someone who likes English literature, would like to be a librarian, it's also the case that there aren't many librarian jobs around. They're very scarce. On the other hand, there are many jobs in the banking industry. So while there are many people in the banking industry who might be librarians, and perhaps fewer librarians who might want to be in the banking industry, it's more likely that Mary works in the banking industry than is a librarian, simply because there are so few jobs. So this is where the representative heuristic can mislead us. We're looking for all of the characteristics that fit, but they don't actually comply with the range of actual values in the environment. So the heuristic is, we're judging the probability of frequency of a hypothesis by considering how much the hypothesis resembles available data, as opposed to using a Bayesian calculation, thinking, okay, if there are so many of these, then how likely is it that there is this particular outcome? And an example in an investing context, so people will often confuse a good company with a good investment. So they'll invest in companies with a history of consistent earnings, which will ignore the fact that few companies can sustain higher levels of growth. And also, this might account for the market-to-book anomaly, which I'll explain later in the course. The second heuristic is the preference for familiarity. So people have more confidence in things with which they're familiar, and further, more information generates greater confidence, even though the information may not be relevant. So, for example, of the first bias, that we find that analysts' stock recommendations are coloured by their cultural biases. So this is especially true when they evaluate firms named after their country of domicile. So if you're living in, say, Australia, and you find that a company is called Australia Inc. or has some link to Australia, you're more likely to favour that company. So, and we find that equity analysts, and these are professionals, don't forget, so a study found that equity analysts are less likely to recommend stocks from countries their nation is biased against. So we find that here, Northern Europeans disproportionately trust Southern Europeans, and the same is true the other way around. Southern Europeans disproportionately trust Northern Europeans. There's an interesting one over here. Britain tends to disproportionately trust Ireland, but the Irish don't reciprocate. They don't trust the British. Even though the British might trust the Irish more, the Irish, perhaps reflecting the history or perhaps something else, don't tend to trust the British. The storytelling. When you're telling a story told by someone as part of it is viewed as much more credible than one told by someone from the outside. And success in the past experience is viewed as a predictor of future success, even if it's not. So here you'll often someone will tell you that a successful stock investor will come up and if they tell you a story, you're more inclined to believe them, or they tell you some investing tips, you're more inclined to believe them than if they're told by someone else whom you don't think has had that experience, even though the tips might be equally valid. And in the case of decisions from description, people make choices if they overweight the probability of rare events. In the case of decisions from experience, people make choices if they underweight the probability of rare events. I'll leave you to think about this one, and you can, if you like, I would recommend that you download the presentation, Numbers and Narratives, Model Story, where he'll describe this heuristic in more detail. The anchoring and adjustment heuristic. This is one of the more interesting ones. So, I think, is the proportion of African countries in the United Nations greater or less than 5%? Is the population of Greece greater or less than 20%? What's the population of Indonesia? About 25 million. So I'd like you to take a minute to guess at these, if you don't know them. Obviously, if you're from Indonesia, or if you're from Greece, you'll know the answer. Or indeed, if you're from Africa, you'll know the answer to the first one. But if you don't fit any of those categories and you don't have this information, then I'd like you to put an answer. Your best guess. The thing is, the proportion of African countries in the United Nations, you're likely, you don't know, but I've seeded the estimate by giving you this number. I've just picked it arbitrarily. Is it 5%? And you'll make a guess. You'll think, oh no, maybe it's less than 5%. You don't hear of many countries in the United Nations. Or maybe it's greater than 5%. It's got to be more. So you might say more. You might say, oh, it's maybe 8%. Or maybe 10%. The thing is, you're using this 5% as the anchor from which you are then adjusting to come up at your guess. In fact, the true proportion of African countries in the United Nations is 25% or thereabouts. Is the population of Greece greater or less than 20 million? So I looked at this and I thought, this was some years back when I came across this question. I thought, surely it's more than 20 million. I thought it must be about 40 million. In fact, the population of Greece is 15 million, which is much, much smaller than I thought. I mean, you hear about Greece so much, I just assumed that it would be much bigger, but it's way smaller than even Australia in terms of population there. The population of Indonesia, 25 million? No, that's way too little. So you think maybe 50 million, because it's double, 50 million. Turns out the population of Indonesia is 245 million. Again, you might have known that it's more than 25 million, but because you're giving this anchor, it's 25 million, you sort of think, okay, I'll adjust it there. So this is really useful, because if it comes to things like bargaining for a salary, for instance. So you might decide, you go into your boss and you think, I want a raise. So what should you go for? Should you go for just 10%? Or should you go for 40%? Nothing like 40%, that's ridiculous. I'm not worth 40% more than I'm paid now. And maybe you know that. And maybe he knows that as well, or she knows that. But if you go on with 40%, she'll think, don't be ridiculous. I'll give you 20%. There. She's cut it in half and given you 20%, whereas really you might only be worth 10%, or maybe not at all. But by putting that 40% out there, you've used it as the anchoring point from which the boss then makes the adjustment. So that's a negotiating tactic for you. On the other side, if you're asking for a cost, you might want to actually, if someone's bidding, if putting a claim, you might want to make them make the claim, and then, or bidding for a construction that you want and they'll put down a price and maybe put down a lower price in order to win the claim, rather than you sort of specifying a price yourself. Another one is the illusion of truth heuristic. So, and this is remarkable, people, and this works a lot, people are more inclined to believe a statement when it comes in the form of information that's easy to process. So familiar, easy combinations, yellow with banana, are easier to process than unfamiliar ones. So it says, the most brilliant propagandist technique will yield no success unless one fundamental principle is borne constantly. It must confine itself to a few points and repeat them over and over. And this is true now as it ever was before. You'll see fake news or whatever being repeated, but these are simple stories that, if told often enough, become more and more plausible to the listeners. So someone said, a con artist was saying, when you're trying to scam people, it's got to be something that they can understand. Diet pills or television campaigns, order products. Anything that makes sense to people. Anything that doesn't need explaining, that can be explained maybe briefly in a 2 or 3 minute phone call. And again, this is a skill I'd urge you to acquire. When you're trying to pitch an idea, make it as simple as possible. That's why people talk about an elevator pitch, or a lift pitch, as you might say in Australia. The idea has to be simple, that you can explain it to someone whilst you're traveling up and down the lift. If you're together, if you happen to be with your potential sponsor, financial sponsor, you'll have about 10 or 15 seconds to explain this idea. You should be able to explain it so simply that they can understand it. That'll make it more plausible. They're more likely to give you the money. A few years back, there was a scam in Western Australia for a product called Firepower. This was in the days when petrol was quite expensive, and so the thing was, they said, you can pop this into your petrol tank and increase the fuel efficiency. Of course, they didn't do anything of the sort, but when you have an ad on TV saying this, and you sort of think, yeah, that sort of makes sense. It's like a Barocca pill. When I have a Barocca pill, I feel a lot more energetic. This must be the same kind of thing with a car. They pop it in the tank, it makes my fuel go longer. It's not true, of course, but it makes sense. So people went for this. the product was called Firepower. The next one is the fifth one in the series here. There are many of these. I'm just explaining 7. Is when people look at an event, a probability of event, people will often reach back to the most recent examples and underweight the earlier examples. So, in other words, whatever is most in front of mind will be judged more probable. Whatever occurred back in the past, in the distant past, will be assessed less probable. So, in a few years back, my colleague and I, Robert Duran, we looked at how people formed their portfolio. And we found that students in a BRW competition tended to select stocks that had appeared in the news most recently. So this explained around 50% of their portfolio selection. Just by being in the news, it made it more prominent to them, so people picked it, and therefore in their stock portfolio. It wasn't that it was necessarily a better company than the others. It just happened to be the ones that were most readily available, that came to mind most easily. So we can have this, there's an investing strategy here that people understand, or researchers, and this is Richard Sloan, who's a former, he's a current graduate of UWA, a former student rather, and always will be a graduate of UWA. And he's done a study that shows that investment fundamentals such as earnings and cash flows explain only a small proportion of the variation in stock returns. Most of the reason why stock goes up and down is explained by the investor recognition. The extent to which a stock appears in the public domain, in the news, that's what drives people to buy it. So what this means is if you can develop an index of investor recognition, so you get an extent of how much publicity a stock has got in the press, in the recent press, you will see its price going up, other things being equal. And then it's more likely to be inflated. So over time, when the publicity, the price will be, the attention will drive up the price, then over time, as it drops out of the news and as people realize the performance isn't really worth as much as they paid for it, it will reverse. So you can potentially construct a portfolio that makes abnormal returns based on investor recognition, on an index of investor recognition. There. So contemporaneous stock returns are positively related. So current stock returns are positively related to changes in investor recognition. Future stock returns are negatively related. So a stock return that is recognized now will have an increase in price. Later on, it'll be bid up. That increase will lead it to be bid up above, say, what it's really worth in terms of cash flows. In future, as it falls out of attention, it'll drop back. Yeah. So that's the finding. The illusion of control is the tendency for people to overestimate their ability to control events. So we have here, you see, boys will be boys, gender overconfidence, and common stock investment. Boys tend to be more overconfident in the value of their investments, or how good their investments are. In Korea, which has one of the fastest internet connections access in the world, people go online for a variety of things, but they also go online for trading. And the more they go online for trading, the more information they get. Much of it is irrelevant, but it means that they get the illusion of control. So they end up trading stocks, and because much of that information is relevant, they end up churning their stocks, so they lose money from churning, buying and selling too frequently. So we see here from Andy Lowe that these subjects, when they earn money, and this is you get stimulated, you go into the market, you get a quick win, and the part of the brain that lights up when you win something is the same part that cocaine stimulates. So there's a real high, real addiction to trading there. Mental accounting. So this is, people will have in their mind, they'll have different slots for different levels of savings. And here you have Mr. and Mrs. J have saved $15,000 towards their dream home. They hope to buy the home in 5 years. the money earns 10% in the money market account. They've just bought a car which they financed with a 3-year car loan at 15%. So you can see this doesn't seem to make sense. They should keep all their money, all the money that they've saved towards their dream home. So they would be better off buying the car with the money that they've saved, because they're financing it at a loan at 15%, and they're earning just 10% on the money that they have in the bank, which will be taxed as well. So they're getting less than 10% on the money they have, and they're paying a 15% 3-year car loan. It doesn't make sense. But the reason why they're doing this is because they feel they have a better sense of control over their things. They're mentally put, this is a side for the house, this is the part for our car. These are two separate financial decisions. If they had a better control over their finances, or they had better self-control, they might link them together. But they're probably, in some ways, being quite sensible and thinking, no, if we just have the one account, we might overspend. So let's put these two accounts separately. On another thing, you see Mr. S admires a $250 jacket in a store. He doesn't buy it because he feels it's too extravagant. Later that month, he receives the same sweater from his wife for his birthday present. He's very happy. He's truly happy. And him and his wife have only joint bank accounts. And I can say, based on experience, this is indeed a true thing. That you might see something, but if you and your wife or your husband have, until they come to the party and agree with you that this is a good thing as well, or they give it to you as a gift, you don't feel as happy if you buy it yourself. Now these are the self-deception mechanisms. Extensive evidence shows that people are overconfident in their judgments. So confidence intervals assigned to estimate of quantities are too low. Their 98% confident intervals include a true quantity only 60% of the time. You'll have an exercise in the tutorial that takes you through this, but what this says is they ask you, let's say you're asked to estimate what the temperature will be next week. So you're asked to give the range of what the temperature will be next week, and it's got to be wide enough to include, for you to be 98% confidence that the temperature will fall between in the range that you specify. It turns out that we'll be overconfident, so the range which we specify will be correct only about 60% of the time. So people calibrate poorly when estimating events. Events they think are certain occur only around 80% of the time. Events deemed impossible to occur around 20% of the time. So when you're looking at election results and things, people will write off a candidate saying, oh, he's got no chance, and it's to say Donald Trump. And actually, they're way before he got elected in 2016. But as late as 2015, or even indeed a couple of months, and even on the polling day, people thought it's going to be impossible that he would win, but actually he did win. So it's in line with this. People calibrate poorly when estimating events. Another form of self-deception is optimism and wishful thinking. People display unrealistically rosy views of their abilities and prospects. They predict tasks such as writing assignments, writing lectures, will be completed much sooner than they actually are. So why, in what way is this good? It's, one way this is good, how can I said these are evolutionary adaptations, how can being wrong, deceiving yourself be good? It could be good because it gives you the confidence to do things that you otherwise wouldn't do. And sometimes we need to take a risk. And if we knew the true odds of the event, we mightn't take that risk. But taking the risk might be good for us. So if we knew how long it really took to write a book, write an assignment, we might be completely discouraged. But if we think it'll be completed a bit sooner, then we'll agree to take on the tasks. And so there's some beneficial, so relative to depressives, normals, that is people who aren't depressive, show several characteristics. Normal people inflate others' view of them. They're more prone to illusions of control, the perception that they can control objectively uncontrollable outcomes. Non-depressives underestimate the negative feedback they've received. So you give them some feedback and then they'll think, this is a great outcome. Non-depressive overestimate the predictability of and control they have over positive outcomes, and underestimate the predictability of undesired outcomes. So non-depressives will probably think that they all are going to live to over 90, when actually the average age is, or the expected age is around 80 plus. So what's the emotional overriding of reason can also be beneficial, because what you're doing here is you're sending a credible a signal of commitment. If someone knows that you're really committed, so if you're in a bargaining situation or you're in a kind of a fight where the other person knows that no matter what, you won't give up until you're dead or whatever, you won't be shaken from your course of action, they're more likely to give in early in the game because they'll think it's pointless going on. So that's why if you become highly emotional and become unreasonable, that could have been a survival mechanism, because people then know they stop fighting with you, or they give in because they know it's just nothing will make you see sense. There's this game of chicken where two people, it's not a very clever game to play, but two people ride to each other in a car, and the car that veers off course, they ride straight in line, is the loser. So what you can do if you want to win, but it's risky, is you tie a bandana around your head and then you start driving. The other person sees you've got the bandana over your eyes, cannot see, they swerve, and you win. Well, hopefully they swerve. If they've got a bandana as well, you both. That's bad for both of you. Yeah. So, the question, having gone through those, and I'd urge you to go and read up more about each of these biases. There's a list of readings over here, but also look them up on the internet on various cases. But the question we now address is, can we and should we control our biases, and if so, how? It's quite difficult, because Daniel Kahneman, he pioneered this field, and he says over here that my intuitive thinking is just as prone to overconfidence, extreme predictions, and a planning fallacy, a tendency to underestimate how long it'll take to complete a task. So his thinking is just the same as it was before I finally made a study of these issues. And I'd recommend his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. It turns out that we can actually change. There are some things, part of it, the big question is how much of this is innate and how much is this conditioned by the environment. There's a great article here, which is The Weirdest People in the World, which makes the point that people living in modern industrial societies are actually not the normals, but because we've developed in such an odd environment, such an unnatural environment, that we don't see things the way other people who were brought up in a more natural environment would see them. So, for example, for us, it seems natural that the line in the middle is the longer one, but actually this is only because we're conditioned, we've lived in an environment where straight edges and straight lines give us certain expectations. People who are brought up in an environment where there aren't straight lines and edges see each of these lines as being perfectly, there's no illusion for them. They see them as being all three straight in a row. So what we can do, though, is by being aware of these biases, is that we can put ourselves in a situation where we effectively don't fall prey to them. And this is the tale of Ulysses and the sirens. So just an analogy over here. Ulysses was going back with the Argonauts, going back to the island back to his home island. And on the way back, they were passing this mythical place where you had the sirens. The sirens were these women with birds, with bodies of birds, and their business model was singing beautiful songs that would cause the ships to sail closer to hear them, and then they'd be shipwrecked on the rocky shores, and the sirens would then ransack the boat and kill all the sailors. So Ulysses wanted to avoid this fate. He wanted to avoid being lured to the island by the songs. And so what he instructed his men is for them to put wax in their ears, and then he tied himself to the mast, but left his ears unclogged, so that he could hear them, but he couldn't actually tell his men to row closer, or if they did, they wouldn't hear him. So basically, he put himself in a position where he was aware of the effect of the sirens, but he couldn't respond to them. And that's my point. You don't try to fight these biases, but try to put yourself in a position where you're not actually prone to being prey to them. So is the knowledge of psychology useful in investing? Yeah, it is in investing, but people generally tend to think that they'll use this because they'll see how other people are behaving rather than themselves. So they'll use it to infer the behavior and the motives of other people, but they won't actually apply it to themselves. So this is the Cassandra learning effect. The Cassandra was the Greek prophet whose curse was to tell true things, but not to be believed by those who heard them. So the Cassandra learning effect is something I've coined, where you are taught something that is true, but you don't believe or don't behave as though it applies to you. Yeah. So now I've explained and illustrated the aspects of behavioral models. I now want to show when should we identify the scope of behavioral in the neoclassical finance models. The two models are different, but we don't need to use one exclusively. We should change depending on the context and what we want to explain. Yeah. So someone's made this point, the scope of behavior, in relation to behavioral finance, that he says, this behavioral finance model, it's good. Everyone says that we're ruled by our emotions. And it's true, but it's just a series of stories. So there's a reference to behavioral biases exhibited by investors, but what we don't have is a coherent theory of how markets work. It's simply a collection of investors' behavioral tendencies that may have influenced how some prices are set in some markets. So there's behavioral finance, a study of the bleeding obvious. His point's a good one. I mean, if it's just all about a series of anecdotes and a series of a listing of the biases to which people are prone, that's really not systematic enough to be much use in helping to analyze markets. So it says, and to make the point more clearly, let's assume prices are determined by investors acting on the basis of their emotions. Say we agree that markets are run by investors behaving in emotional ways. How would this affect your investment approach? Would it be easy to make profitable investments knowing that investors' psychology determines share prices? Basically, are you so different from the rest of the crowd that you can outsmart the crowd? So the neoclassical people, the rational economists, their critique is, neoclassical theory works well. If it ain't broke, we don't fix it. Neoclassical theory we don't actually need behavioral finance. The second point is that individual behavior is irrelevant. In the aggregate, markets are efficient. So we might find that people are behaving irrationally at an individual level, but their biases all cancel out. In the aggregate, markets are efficient. And also they say that behavior driven by apparent bias or emotion is often rational when viewed in a wider context. The rationality of behavior is often obscure. So just because it seems that people are behaving rationally doesn't mean, or irrationally, it doesn't mean that they are. And finally, what they'll say is that if there are any inefficiencies, then the smart investors will arbitrage away the inefficiencies. And the third criticism is, where's the unified theory of behavioral finance? So biases revealed by behavioral finance research are simply a collection of stories, of anecdotes that don't form a coherent theory that allow precise predictions. Much behavioral finance is just storytelling, people telling anecdotes, plausible-looking anecdotes after the fact, but they don't allow for specific predictions before. On the other side, the behavioral critique of neoclassical finance. But they say, so this is the behavioral finance people criticizing the neoclassical people, they say market prices are often unbiased and efficient. So we're not saying that markets don't work, but on occasion prices can diverge from fundamental value due to systematic investor biases. And behavioral finance can explain these biases. Further, they also say that limits to arbitrage imply inefficiencies can exist. The smart investors aren't always able to arbitrage away inefficient prices. So, for example, if house prices get too high, there's no way you can short sell houses. So there's no way that a smart investor, knowing that house prices are too high, can short sell the houses, and make money from that particular trade. There just isn't the mechanisms available in the market to short sell houses. And also, there are lots of markets or lots of transactions where people aren't trading with each other, but they're making decisions. And so our focus isn't necessarily on the whole market, but also on individuals making individual transactions, not in the context of, outside the context of a market. And they also say that, on the other hand, they also say that neoclassical theory is not scientific. Because neoclassical theorists will never accept evidence that markets are inefficient, but always make up a story to make facts consistent with efficiency. So this is part of the joint hypothesis problem. Whenever you point out to apparent market inefficiency, they'll say, well, but if you look at it this way, this can explain why the market is reacting, therefore it's efficient. The limits to arbitrage, and so to expand on this argument, what they mean by the arbitrage arguments for efficiency is that if noise investors, that is, the dumb investors, push prices too far, smart investors sell or buy until the right price is reached. Noise investors lose money and don't survive. The assumption is that the smart investors have sufficient funds to outweigh the noise investors, and that there is a way for them to profit from their better information. But what the efficient market critics, the people argue, the behavioral finance people argue, is that in many cases the noise investors can be so numerous that they overwhelm the smart investors. So no matter how much the smart investors trade, their numbers are not enough to overwhelm the noise investors. So prices can remain inefficient for a long period of time. It's also difficult to distinguish between noise and smart. There's no science saying this is the right information, the wrong information. So it can be hard to distinguish noise investors from smart investors. So the question then becomes, how, given that we can conceive that sometimes market prices will deviate from fundamental value, whatever that fundamental value is, how economically significant are those deviations? If they're very minor, we need to worry about this. What we find is that, so for example, it seems that these deviations can be quite high. At the end of 1998, large American corporations were trading at some of the historically highest market values relative to most measures of profitability. For instance, the ratio of the market value of the S&P 500 group of stocks to the aggregate earnings of the underlying companies stood around 32. So the earnings of the price of each of the stocks was 32 times their annual earnings compared to the postal average of 15. So Robert Shiller and other leading market commentators such as Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan called attention to excessive valuations of large cap stocks as early as 1996. But other people said large American companies are operating in a new world of faster growth and lower risk, and hence rationally warrant higher prices. Similarly, Irving Fisher argued that stock prices have reached a new and permanently high plateau just before the market tanked and the economy plunged into the Great Depression. The point being here is that prices can stay up for a long period of time, even and seem out of whack. It can be difficult to bring them back to fundamental value. So, to illustrate this point, Andre Schleifer says, if someone identified that the S&P 500 index at the beginning of 1998 was too high, he would have suffered a loss of 28.6% by the year end, because it just kept on going higher. In fact, if he sold short early on when the expects got worried at the beginning of 1997, he'd have lost 33.4% that year before losing another 28.6% the next year. So you can see that in some cases you can believe that an asset is overvalued, yet be too scared to short sell because you're scared that the price might go up, as indeed it did in this particular case. So the point being, prices can stay overvalued by some measures for a long period of time because there's no one in the market able to go on the opposite side of the trade and bring them down. This is a good point over here because it means that when it has an implication for investing. It's not enough to identify a over or undervalued stock. You've got to identify some kind of a trigger to make sure that you can profit from the correction when it eventually comes. So here you see that trader John Paulson made billions on subprime market on the crash, but as he said, merely holding a different opinion from the blundering herd wasn't enough to produce huge profits. He also had to think up a technical way to bet against the market and mortgage market, given as notes you can't short houses. There. So this is a point for your assignment. Your assignment asks you to invest at the end, to make an investment holding at the end on the date that you are due to submit your assignment, and you have until 1 year for that investment to pay off. So basically, you have to pick investments that will pay off, that something will ensure that you think something will happen within that 1 year to allow the market to come around to what you think is the correct valuation for your stocks. I'll give you more guidance on that in a later lecture. So, to show this thing about mortgage, how prices can be wrong for long periods of time. So this is Steve Kerr. He was wrong on Australian house prices, and this was written on 28th of February, I think about 3 or 4 years back. He said, I was hopelessly wrong on house prices. Ask me how. He says, I got the cause of the Aussie house price bubble right, but the direction of the cause wrong. The fundamental determinant of house prices mortgage debt. I thought that, as had happened to Japan after the bubble economy burst, the Australian economy would start to deliver after the GFC, and this process would take house prices down. This is what happened in the US and most of the first world. It says the house correction won't be orderly. Property Australia, this is what he was thinking. Australia may be where the US was in 2008. In fact, there has been no crash. There has been some slight correction, but certainly no crash. And here we are in 2020. So, making use of behavioral finance theory in broad. There's two contexts. There's the decision making in relation to personal finance, making your own choices, and exploiting market prices created by other people's mistakes. The point I want to make here is that think about your own decision making, think about your own biases, and use the biases to correct your own trading. Don't try to use the biases to correct other people's trading. So don't rely on other people's biases and think that you can profit from them. So on the other hand, the fact many people enjoy trying to beat the market. So if you find active investing pleasurable, then it's rational to, if you think that the market is inefficient and that you can beat it, then it's rational to indulge in it, even if you lose money. The fun is part of your return there. So this is the kind of attitude that George Best said, I spent 90% of my money on wine, women and song, the rest I wasted. So if you enjoy spending money on the market and you don't really care whether it's you win or you lose, then you've had your return, as long as you're having fun. So short horizon pricing. So this is where there are mispricing. There's an identifiable and commonly agreed benchmarks of correct prices. There are liquid markets, and the short end game and positions are paid off. These are good. This is a good situation where everyone agrees on what's the right value. The market is liquid. You can buy and sell quickly, and the positions are paid off. The problem is these situations are very rare. What is more common is, if indeed it is a mispricing, is long horizon mispricing, where there's no commonly agreed benchmark of correct price, where the payoffs occur at some indefinite time in the future, and the market is illiquid, so it's hard to exploit because there isn't just that much demand or supply of particular stocks. But also, maybe it doesn't matter that much. If you look, how many behavioral finance economists does Warren Buffett employ? The number is approximately 0. He relies on the fundamental investments and doesn't rely so much on trying to predict other people's mispricing. He just relies on his own estimates of value, and when he sees a good bargain, he goes in there and he doesn't mind what other people think. Yeah. So to conclude then, the common classical finance critique of anomalies is that if mispricing is readily available, an attractive opportunity to make profits exists, and investors would immediately snap up attractive profit-making opportunities, thereby eliminating mispricing. So they say this is why we don't believe the market is inefficient, because if a mispricing is so obvious, people would see this and then they would pick up that, invest accordingly and eliminate the mispricing. But on the other hand, the behavioralists say that only one is true. People do snap up attractive profit-making opportunities, but the problem is when there is often mispricing, there isn't often an attractive opportunity to make profits. Things can be mispriced, and yet the risk can still be there for some considerable time. Okay, thank you. This was my first ever lecture without a audience, so I hope it's come across well. I generally don't listen to my lectures again, but I will this time, and I'll look for improvements. But thank you for your patience. All the best for Easter, and I look forward to giving another lecture in 2 weeks, in 3 Fridays from now. Okay, bye.